While exploring the concept of privilege the last time, we have encountered an observable occurrence where one of the implications of maintaining privilege applied to the unlikely elite of modern times identity politics proponents. I would like to pursue this topic today. Let's begin with the universal. As we had established, possessing a privilege, that is, a special right or permission applying exclusively to its recipients, entails a necessity to live up to the responsibilities tied to the inevitable societal advantage of any scope and in any respect. This means if a person has some sort of a special right, they will be required to ensure it still applies to them. It is necessary to mention, if a privilege is granted to a specified group or collective, it must apply to all members of said collective or be void. That also means one has to remain in adherence to that collective in order to be eligible. Now, there is a certain right that only applies to a certain group in specific, albeit dreadful, circumstances. And this is the right of the victimized to name their victimizers. The right to indicate a perpetrator is an exclusive one. One becomes entitled to name whoever have been wronging them and consequentially seek justice for themselves and warrant condemnation for the oppressor. At the same time, they are being understandably socially acquitted from outright disbelief that would be directed toward any other sort of a claim made by anyone, granting them the right to expect investigation of the alleged perpetrator's deeds as priority. All this befits only a person who suffered through something destructive from the hands of somebody else. As it is, victimhood of any sort means a grave impairment to the person in question, gripping on their very life, health, and psychological and physical integrity. Victims deserve nothing less than empathy, support, and morally warranted recompense. That same right comes with requirements. Once a victim makes a claim, they must take it to a court of law to obtain a resolution to their grievance. Furthermore, this claim needs to be substantiated by evidence once it's presented before a judge. At the same time, suspension of disbelief is applied to protect their credibility. Therefore, any potential inquiry must assert that the accuser acts and testifies in good faith. All this does not necessarily mean all court rulings end up being just. After all, justice is blind and only weighs what can be put on the scales. Much of abuse toward people remains undetected and hidden for various reasons, be it shame preventing one from ever voicing their peril, fear of further abuse for reporting, psychological disorders, social standing, insufficient evidence, or, in some cases, lack of adequate definitions for abuse within law itself, like United Kingdom's gendered rape law, not recognizing rape perpetrated on a man by a woman. Mentioning specifically the British because there was an effort lately to change this state of affairs by means of a petition to the British lawmakers. It has been declined, on the grounds of the law supposedly satisfying the issue in question. Take this as you will. However, having said all this, there exists a life outside of world's courts. Life filled with people with their personal allegiances, solidarity and judgments. This fellow sentience refers of course to the society at large, which, as we know, does not function as a court of law, which, outside of the lack of judicial power, is also exempt from the procedural stipulations, more often than not enabling the societal judgment to become a caricature of a judicial process itself. What must be noted at this point is what kind of feelings a victim elicits in society members. Any sort of victimization of a person by another is, after all, outright disgusting, and as such it's being rightfully shunned by and enraging for any sensible human being. It befalls righteous ire upon the perpetrator for breaking the civil code that binds us on a collective agreement of the Western world, to bring no harm to the fellow human being. Whenever an instance of such transgression emerges to the public eye, judgments will be aplenty. It's our humanity's selfless impulse to ensure peaceful conduct, ceasing judgment to scrutinize whoever transgresses as a first response. After all, the source of the harm needs to be eradicated in the first place, and we all should do our utmost to ensure we have determined the right culprit, forming a protective circle around the victim so no more harm befalls them. Let us never forget the priority lies with prevention of harm, and when it happens nonetheless, Our impulse is to make amends in order to prevent it happening again. This is done foremost by incapacitating the perpetrator, and this is why the efforts tied to handling abuse bring the focus to the alleged abuser. Prior to this, such an abuser must be indicated, and nobody is more qualified to make this indication than a victim. This victim becomes protected from further wrongings, one of which would be incredulity. In order to ensure efficiency of establishing guilt, the indication itself is a weight-bearing claim and suffices for incrimination. After all, regardless of what the occurrences were, one must inherently possess a reason to make the claim in the first place. Therefore, unlike within courtrooms, substance of a claim effectively becomes the claim itself. Not unlike any other sort of power, this is perfectly open to abuse. The escalation of victimhood claims has been a rising concern, partly because more people open up about their misery and seek help, and this is, without question, ultimately a good outcome of awareness campaigns and such, despite the horror of abuse it relies on, because it has the potential of contributing to the invention of more efficient resolutions to grievances raised. However, it's the definition of abuse itself that has been simultaneously having its goalposts moved. While physical abuse leaves physical evidence and therefore can be empirically examined with a wide array of tools and measures, limiting its nuances to the apparent resulting damage, there exists non-physical harm established as fact. Verbal abuse, psychological abuse, limiting of rights and freedoms. These seem to line up and never end because they don't occur in a physical space they would oversaturate. That means they can become unfalsifiable due to, say, psychological damage threshold of the person enduring them. From here, it is the victim's prerogative to expect their experience respected. Empathetic social justice proponents proceed to frame the experience itself as the sole valid measure of the harm done. That framework can and is being exploited to validate personal inconveniences as abuse, then weaponized to attack the source of inconvenience on grounds of harmful social misconduct. By sheer reason of it being unfalsifiable, it can include any remotely adverse experience under the sun. All it takes is for the person experiencing it to feel insecure enough for the sake of it. Or, to wrap it up, one can now be accused of sexual assault merely on the basis of the accuser's inner reception of somebody's eyesight setting on their person. To all the prospective victims, however, there is a caveat: your experience will be at the same time mercilessly invalidated if your identity adheres to any socially privileged group. We have already touched on the topic of privilege as seen through the prism of academic social studies before, and here is when identity plays a role in assigning both privileges and victimhood. Wrong identity politics being invoked will be talked about in one of the upcoming pieces. Here's another point to make. Abuse by definition establishes an uneven power dynamic in an interaction. This directly means that an abuser gains an advantage over the abused. However, social justice adherents propose that in order for abuse to occur, the abuser must already possess a power advantage. Merge the two premises and the result is a circular logic, but it also leads further. If position of power is required to abuse, only the one in power can be an abuser. Based on this, in every instance of victimhood being claimed, one only needs to compare how privileged either party is to determine guilt. After all, it's only the non-privileged to whom oppression can be applied, and privilege implies power. An oppressed privileged person is an oxymoron. Based on all this, let us now draw a conclusion. Victimhood only applies to someone without social privilege. A victim can expect their claims to remain largely uncontested due to their experience being the measure of the harm. The harm experienced can be directed at the abuser as evidence of the wrongdoing. As a result, the victim gains societal protection, and the abuser becomes perfectly open to societal punishment. Loss of reputation and trustability, negative reception in social and career circles. Effectively, the victim gets to decide which privileged life to put in peril and gain social advantage for themselves. In turn, what remains in the way of responsibilities is to maintain the unprivileged status, actively exhibit one's unprivileged identity attributes, and hold on to the claims, if not escalate them. At the same time, the lower the threshold of abuse defined, the more people it is likely to apply to. Therefore, the numbers of possibly victimized grow, through which this group gets this much closer to being a majority. And the social studies have already established that being a part of majority comes with an automatic, unconscious privilege. This is how victimhood privilege works. The only way to abuse it is to stop being a victim. And nowadays, a simple disagreement is being misconstrued as an attack on somebody's self-esteem, which now becomes more and more synonymous with one's identity itself, especially with respect to those whose identity haven't yet grown beyond self-regard. Let that sink in. I am done reasoning.